The smoke had barely cleared from Joe Masseria's body when Salvatore Maranzano stood before the assembled crime bosses of New York, his eyes gleaming with an ambition that had been carefully concealed during the Castellammarese War. The old Sicilian, educated and cunning, had orchestrated the conflict's final act with precision, but now he revealed something far more audacious than anyone had anticipated. He declared himself Capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses, a title that echoed through the underworld like a challenge wrapped in velvet. Maranzano's vision was nothing less than the complete restructuring of organized crime in America, but his model was ancient, transplanted directly from the sun-baked hills of Sicily. He divided New York into 5 distinct families, each with its own territory and hierarchy, a system that would endure for decades. Yet this organizational genius came with a profound catch. Maranzano placed himself at the apex, demanding absolute obedience and tribute from every family. He fashioned himself as a modern Caesar, even keeping Latin texts on his desk and studying the Roman Empire's power structures with scholarly devotion. The older Sicilian mobsters nodded their approval, recognizing the familiar patterns of the old country, where tradition and bloodline determined everything. Maranzano insisted on the ancient codes, the rigid protocols, the unquestioning deference to those born in Sicily. He structured the families with military precision, soldiers, capos, underbosses, and bosses, all reporting ultimately to him. Every significant decision required his blessing, every dispute needed his mediation, every ambitious move demanded his approval. But in the smoke-filled rooms where younger gangsters gathered, a different conversation was taking place. Lucky Luciano, still in his 30s, sat with Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, and others who had been born in America or arrived as children. They had fought alongside Maranzano to eliminate Masseria, believing they were creating something new, something American. Instead, they found themselves trapped in an even more suffocating hierarchy than before. Luciano watched Maranzano with growing alarm as the self-proclaimed supreme boss began behaving like a petty tyrant. The mandatory tributes flowed upward, enriching Maranzano while limiting the earning potential of the younger generation. More troubling were the restrictions on who could conduct business with whom. Maranzano's Sicilian prejudices meant that the profitable alliances Luciano had cultivated with Jewish gangsters like Lansky were viewed with suspicion and disdain. The younger bosses had envisioned a rational criminal enterprise, something that transcended the old country's blood feuds and provincial loyalties. They had fought a war to escape one dictator only to find themselves serving another. Maranzano's insistence on the Sicilian way clashed violently with the American reality these men inhabited. They spoke English, wore American suits, and understood American business principles. They saw opportunity where Maranzano saw only tradition. Whispers began circulating that Maranzano was compiling a list, planning to eliminate anyone who might challenge his authority. Lucky Luciano's name was allegedly at the top. The old Sicilian, for all his classical education and organizational brilliance, had made a fatal miscalculation. He had assumed that power, once seized, could be maintained through fear and tradition alone. He failed to recognize that the young wolves he had helped unleash would never willingly submit to another king. The conference room in Maranzano's office building might have been mistaken for a legitimate business headquarters, with its polished mahogany and leather chairs, except for the men who filled it. Salvatore Maranzano stood at the head of the table, speaking in rapid Sicilian dialect, his hands gesturing with theatrical flourish as he invoked the sacred traditions of Cosa Nostra. To him, the criminal organization was not merely a business, but a brotherhood, bound by blood oaths and ancient codes that stretched back centuries to the hills of Palermo and Corleone. Lucky Luciano sat near the middle of the table, his face an impassive mask, as he listened to the older man's passionate discourse about honor and respect. Inside, however, his mind was calculating, measuring, evaluating. Maranzano spoke of vendetta, of settling scores that originated in Sicilian villages decades earlier, of maintaining purity within the organization by excluding non-Sicilians from positions of real authority. To Luciano, these concepts were not just outdated, they were dangerous liabilities in a rapidly modernizing America. The fundamental divide between the two men represented something far larger than a personal power struggle. Maranzano embodied the old world, where a man's worth was determined by his birthplace, his lineage, and his willingness to die for abstract concepts of honor. He conducted initiation ceremonies with needles and burning saints' cards, requiring new members to recite oaths in Italian, binding them to a code that forbade cooperation with authorities under penalty of death. To Maranzano, these rituals were sacred, the very foundation upon which their world was built. Luciano, by contrast, saw the criminal underworld through a different lens entirely. He had grown up on the streets of New York, where survival meant adapting, where success required partnerships with whoever could help you prosper. His closest associate was Meyer Lansky, a brilliant Jewish organizer who understood finance and planning with mathematical precision. Together, they had envisioned something revolutionary, a criminal syndicate that operated like a corporation, with different ethnic groups controlling their specialties, coordinating rather than competing, maximizing profit rather than settling ancient grudges. The philosophical chasm revealed itself in countless small conflicts. Maranzano insisted that only Sicilians could become made members, relegating talented Jewish, Irish, and mainland Italian gangsters to subordinate roles regardless of their abilities. Luciano argued that this arbitrary restriction was leaving money on the table, alienating potential allies, and creating unnecessary enemies. When Maranzano ordered hits based on personal slights or old country feuds, Luciano saw waste and inefficiency. Murder, in Luciano's emerging philosophy, should be a business decision, not an emotional indulgence. Maranzano spoke reverently of omerta, the code of silence, as an unbreakable sacred bond. Luciano understood its practical value, but recognized that absolute rules created brittle organizations. Maranzano wanted soldiers who would die rather than betray the organization. Luciano wanted earners who understood that everyone's prosperity depended on intelligent cooperation. One man saw a medieval order of knights, the other saw a modern business enterprise. The younger generation gathered in speakeasies and nightclubs discussing Maranzano's latest edicts with barely concealed frustration. They had watched legitimate American businesses thrive by embracing efficiency, delegation, and pragmatism. They saw no reason why their enterprise should be shackled to traditions that made sense in 19th century Sicily but were absurd in 20th century New York. Maranzano's insistence on personal loyalty to him as supreme boss struck them as feudalism, a system the modern world had abandoned for good reason. The conflict was inevitable, really. Maranzano could never accept that his carefully preserved traditions were obstacles rather than assets. Luciano could never submit to a system that valued birthplace over talent, ritual over results, and one man's ego over collective prosperity. Between them lay not just a power struggle, but a fundamental question about what organized crime would become in America. The telephone call came at 2 in the morning, pulling lucky Luciano from a restless sleep. The voice on the other end belonged to a man inside Maranzano's inner circle, someone whose loyalty had quietly shifted when the promises of the new regime proved hollow. The message was brief and chilling. Luciano's name was at the top of a list, and the execution order would be carried out within days. Maranzano had decided that the younger boss represented too great a threat to his absolute authority, and in the old Sicilian tradition, threats were eliminated without hesitation or remorse. Luciano replaced the receiver and sat in the darkness of his apartment, his mind already racing through possibilities. He had suspected this moment would come, had seen the way Maranzano looked at him during meetings, the thinly veiled hostility beneath the formal courtesy. But suspicion and confirmation were different animals entirely. Now the question was not whether to act, but how to act with sufficient speed and cunning to survive. Maranzano was surrounded by loyal bodyguards, men who had followed him from Sicily, men who would die protecting their boss. Any conventional hit would be suicide. Within hours, Luciano had convened an emergency meeting with his most trusted associates. Meyer Lansky arrived first, his analytical mind already working through scenarios before Luciano finished explaining the situation. Bugsy Siegel came next, eager and violent, suggesting a full-scale war. But Luciano shook his head, explaining that open warfare would accomplish nothing except getting them all killed. They needed something unexpected, something that would bypass Maranzano's formidable security apparatus entirely. The plan that emerged was audacious in its simplicity and its deception. Maranzano's office building in the heart of Manhattan was a fortress, with lookouts posted at every entrance and exit. His personal bodyguards were professional killers, alert to any threat from rival gangsters. But there was one group of men these guards would never challenge, one authority that even the most hardened criminals respected out of practical necessity: law enforcement. Federal agents could walk past any security, enter any room, and Maranzano's men would stand aside rather than risk the attention that comes from assaulting government officers. Luciano reached out to contacts in the Jewish underworld, men who had no direct connection to the Italian families and whose faces would be unknown to Maranzano's security. He selected 4 professionals, each with military experience and steady nerves. The instructions were precise: dress in conservative suits, carry badges that could pass for federal credentials at a glance, and walk into Maranzano's office building with the confident authority of men who had every right to be there. The disguise was not meant to withstand prolonged scrutiny, only to gain those crucial first moments of confusion and access. The date was set for September 15th, just days after Luciano received the warning. Maranzano had scheduled a meeting at his office, believing himself completely secure in his Manhattan headquarters. He had no reason to suspect that the young boss he planned to eliminate was already several moves ahead, turning Maranzano's own security measures into vulnerabilities. The old Sicilian had prepared for attacks from rival gangsters, for ambushes and shootouts and bombs. He had not prepared for men who would walk through his front door wearing the masks of legitimacy. Luciano spent the night before the hit smoking cigarettes and reviewing every detail. The irony was not lost on him. He was about to kill a man using methods that violated every tradition Maranzano held sacred. No code of honor, no face-to-face confrontation, no respect for the old ways, just cold efficiency and calculated deception. But that was precisely the point. The old ways were dying, and Maranzano's death would be their funeral. In the new world Luciano envisioned, what mattered was not how you killed, but whether you survived. The morning of September 10, 1931, began like any other at the New York Central Building on Park Avenue. Salvatore Maranzano sat in his 9th-floor office, surrounded by the trappings of legitimacy he had carefully cultivated. The brass nameplate on the door read Real Estate Agency, a front that allowed him to conduct business in plain sight. His desk was covered with papers, some legitimate property documents, others coded messages detailing the empire he now controlled. Outside his door, 4 bodyguards sat alert, their eyes scanning everyone who stepped off the elevator, their hands never far from the weapons concealed beneath their jackets. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the elevator doors opened and 4 men emerged. They wore dark suits and fedoras, their faces stern and official. The lead man flashed a badge with practiced authority, announcing in clipped tones that they were federal agents conducting an investigation. The bodyguards tensed, hands moving toward their guns, but the lead man's voice cut through their hesitation. Interfering with federal officers meant headlines, trials, unwanted attention from Washington. One of the guards moved toward the inner office to warn Maranzano, while the others reluctantly allowed the supposed agents to advance. Inside the private office, Maranzano looked up from his desk with irritation rather than alarm. Federal agents were an occupational hazard, nothing more.
He had lawyers, connections, ways of managing such intrusions. He began to stand, perhaps to offer some polite but dismissive greeting, when the lead man pulled not handcuffs but a revolver. The realization came too late. The room exploded with violence as all four men drew weapons simultaneously, the sound of gunfire deafening in the enclosed space. Maranzano tried to reach for the gun in his dress drawer, his instincts finally recognizing the trap, but bullets tore through his chest and abdomen before his fingers touched the handle. He stumbled backwards, crashing against the wall, blood already soaking through his expensive white shirt. The attackers showed no mercy, no hesitation. One of them produced a knife, moving in close even as Maranzano slid down the wall and stabbed him repeatedly with brutal efficiency. It was overkill, a message written in blood and steel. The man who had proclaimed himself boss of all bosses died on the floor of his fake real estate office, his Roman history scattered around him, his dreams of absolute power bleeding out onto the imported carpet. The entire attack lasted less than 2 minutes.
The four men walked calmly back through the outer office, past the bodyguards who stood frozen in confusion and terror. By the time anyone understood what had happened, the killers had disappeared into the crowded Manhattan streets, leaving behind only the echoes of gunfire and a corpse that would change everything. The bodyguards found their boss sprawled in a spreading pool of blood, his eyes still open in surprise, multiple gunshot wounds and stab marks covering his torso. The man who had survived the Castellammarese War, who had orchestrated Masseria's death, who had reorganized the entire structure of organized crime in New York, had been killed with almost insulting ease. News of the assassination spread through the underworld with electric speed. Within hours, every made man in New York knew that Maranzano was dead, killed in his own office by men posing as federal agents. The audacity of it was breathtaking, the implications staggering. If the self-proclaimed capo di tutti capi could be eliminated so efficiently, so publicly, then no one was untouchable. The old rules, the sacred traditions, the elaborate security measures, all had proven worthless against cunning and careful planning. In social clubs and restaurants across the city, gangsters gathered to discuss what came next. Some of Maranzano's loyalists spoke of revenge, of honoring their dead boss through blood vendetta. But these voices grew quieter as the day wore on, as it became clear that Lucky Luciano had orchestrated the hit and that he had the backing of every major young boss in the city. The message was unmistakable. The age of the supreme boss was over, ended by bullets and blades in a Park Avenue office building. The body of Salvatore Maranzano had barely grown cold when Lucky Luciano began making telephone calls. There would be no period of mourning, no elaborate funeral processions, no time wasted on sentimentality. Within 24 hours of the assassination, Luciano had summoned the most powerful crime bosses in New York to a meeting, not to celebrate a victory, but to prevent a catastrophe. The removal of Maranzano had created a vacuum, and Luciano understood that nature abhors a vacuum almost as much as gangsters do. Without immediate action, the city would descend into chaos as ambitious men rushed to claim the throne that Maranzano's blood had vacated. The gathering took place in a nondescript location, far from the public eye, and the men who assembled represented a new generation of criminal leadership. Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, Joe Bonanno, Tommy Lucchese, and others sat around the table, their faces reflecting both relief and uncertainty. Maranzano's death had freed them from a tyrant, but freedom without structure was just another word for anarchy. They had watched the Castellammarese War tear the city apart, had seen profits disappear into bloodshed and revenge. None of them wanted to repeat that experience, yet all of them harbored ambitions that could easily ignite another conflict. Luciano stood before them and made a declaration that would echo through decades of criminal history. There would be no new boss of bosses, he announced. The title that Maranzano had claimed, the absolute authority he had tried to wield, would die with him. No single man would ever again hold such power over the American underworld.
The room fell silent as the implications settled over the assembled bosses. Some nodded immediately, understanding the wisdom. Others looked skeptical, wondering if this was simply Luciano's way of positioning himself for the same role under a different name. But Luciano continued, laying out a vision that was revolutionary in its pragmatism. He proposed the creation of a commission, a board of directors for organized crime. The 5 New York families would each have a vote, along with representatives from other major cities. Disputes would be settled through discussion and majority vote rather than through bullets and bombs. Territory would be respected, cooperation encouraged, and the kind of destructive wars that had plagued the previous decade would be prevented through collective agreement and mutual self-interest. Meyer Lansky sat beside Luciano, occasionally interjecting with the financial logic that made the proposal irresistible. War was expensive, Lansky explained in his quiet, methodical way. Every soldier killed represented lost earning potential. Every business destroyed in crossfire was revenue that disappeared forever. The Prohibition era was ending, and new opportunities in gambling, labor unions, and narcotics required stability and coordination. A commission could regulate these enterprises, prevent ruinous competition, and ensure that everyone prospered according to rational principles rather than ancient feuds. The younger bosses grasped the concept immediately.
This was organized crime reimagined as corporate America, with board meetings instead of bloodbaths, negotiation instead of vendetta. Joe Bonanno, despite being one of Maranzano's closest allies, recognized that the old system had failed. Tommy Lucchese saw the potential for expansion without the constant fear of assassination. Frank Costello, always the diplomat, appreciated the structure that would allow him to cultivate his political connections without worrying about unauthorized hits destabilizing everything. There were concerns, of course, voiced cautiously around the table. How would the commission enforce its decisions if someone refused to comply? Luciano's answer was brutally simple. Any family that violated commission rulings would face the combined might of all the others. It was mutually assured destruction transformed into a peacekeeping mechanism. No single family could stand against the unified power of the rest, which meant compliance was not just advisable, but essential for survival. Within weeks, the commission held its first official meeting. The 5 families of New York were formalized. Luciano's own family, which would eventually bear the Genovese name, the family headed by Vincent Mangano, Joe Bonanno's organization, the Gagliano family that would become the Lucchese family, and Joe Profaci's group. Representatives from Chicago, Buffalo, and other cities were brought into the discussions, creating a national network of coordinated criminal enterprises. The transformation was profound and immediate. Disputes that might have sparked wars were now brought before the commission and resolved through votes. Territory was divided rationally rather than through violence. The ethnic barriers that Maranzano had insisted upon began to crumble as Jewish gangsters like Lansky and Bugsy Siegel operated as full partners with Italian families, their expertise valued over their bloodlines. The criminal underworld became, in its own twisted way, meritocratic and efficient. Maranzano's death had accomplished what his life never could. By dying, he had forced the creation of a system more durable and successful than anything his traditional Sicilian model could have produced. The commission would survive for decades, adapting to changing times, weathering law enforcement pressure, and generating billions of dollars in illegal revenue. It was the ultimate irony. The man who wanted to be Caesar had instead become the catalyst for a republic.